Hello, and welcome to the Deerfield Public Library's Twitch channel. I'm Emily, and it is the day before Halloween, so I have a very special spooky edition of my Storytime for Adults series. I have this amazing picture book biography called She Made a Monster: How Mary Shelley Created Frankenstein. And so this is, I love nonfiction, like picture book biographies for kids. I think that they do a really good job usually, like condensing, and I'm really excited about this one. It's super fun. So I'm not sure how much Anne and Christina have been talking about like Mary Shelley and like how Frankenstein got started, but even if they have, here's a fun story about it anyways. So here we go. 200 years ago, on a wild, stormy night, in a beautiful house on the shores of Lake Geneva in Switzerland, a young woman named Mary sat at her dressing table. She and her friends were staying in the house for the season, visiting Lord Byron, the famous English poet. Mary could hear the others still talking downstairs while she brushed her hair by candlelight, thinking of stories. Stories she'd read, stories she'd heard, stories she wanted to tell, for Mary wanted to become a writer. Her dear friend Percy Shelley, who would soon be her husband, was a poet, and Mary herself came from a family of writers. All around her, she felt the power of words, and she hoped that someday she too would write something important. Something that would hit the world like a bolt of lightning splitting the night sky. But for now, she only wanted to write a ghost story. It had all begun when the friends had read aloud from a book of frightening tales, entertaining each other through the rainy days and nights. Lord Byron had declared, "We should each write a ghost story. In a week, we will see who has written the best one." The week would be up tomorrow. The men had already finished their stories, tales of bloodthirsty vampires and vengeful ghosts. Of course, Byron is sure the best one will be his, Mary thought now. He is an excellent poet after all, but so arrogant. Yet try as she might, Mary had found no way to begin her story. The clock struck midnight. Mary put down her hairbrush and tiptoed into the hall. Over the howling wind, she could hear her friends talking about the latest scientific experiments, their favorite topic. Percy's voice thundered up the stairs. "Electricity," he was saying. "Galvani used it to make a dead frog kick its legs." Dashing back to her room, Mary felt a shiver creep up over her. She remembered hearing as a young girl about an even more ghastly experiment. A scientist made a corpse move using electricity. Mary had shuddered as she listened, clinging to her father's leg. She had only been 6 years old. Spooky. To erase the terrible image from her mind, Mary opened her locket and looked at the tiny portrait of her mother, Mary Wollstonecraft. She died when Mary was just a baby. As a girl, Mary had learned the alphabet by tracing the letters on her mother's tombstone. When she was older, she read everything her mother had written, stirring words about democracy and the rights of women, words that sparked courage and inspiration in many, but anger and outrage in others. Downstairs, the men's voices grew louder and more excited. To give life to timeless matter will be the ultimate triumph. Man will conquer nature and make her give up her secret. Mary shook her head as she listened. Nature might have very good reason for keeping her secrets, she thought. Besides, what would happen to that lifeless matter once someone had given it life? The men did not seem to care. They only asked if something could be done, never if it should. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and the rain beat harder against the window. Mary watched the wax drip down her candle. Now she could hear the others saying goodnight and stepping softly up the stairs. She thought of ghosts and vampires. She thought of monsters. She thought of loneliness. Night was passing, and she still didn't have a story. A flash of lightning illuminated the room, and Mary jumped as her reflection peered back at her from the mirror, pale and strange, like something dead restored to life. Wouldn't it be terrifying to see such a creature, she mused, or perhaps more terrifying, to be such a creature? Mary got into bed and stared up into the darkness. The house by the lake was still. The wind shrieked over the eaves, but only Mary was awake to hear it. She let the booming thunder fill her head. She closed her eyes to the bursts of lightning, but she did not sleep. Instead, as if in a dream, she saw a huge form laying on the table. It was a man, yet not a man. It had a hideous, scarred face. She saw a young student anxiously bending over the form with a candle. He had achieved his ambition. He had discovered nature's secret and given life to the creature on the table. But now he was afraid. He did not know what to do. He dropped the candle, covered his face with his hands, and ran away, hoping the ember of life. And suddenly, laying in her bed with the curtains shut, Mary felt as if she were the young creator. She felt as if she'd run to her room to cower under the sheets, trying not to think of the terrible things she'd created, trying not to think of it coming to find her. She trembled as she imagined a hand, huge and gray, twisted, appearing through the bed curtains. She saw the curtains part. The creature stared down at her with bulging yellow eyes. What did it want from her? Mary gasped and sat up in bed. She ripped open the curtains and recognized her own room in the moonlight. All was familiar and ordinary. There was no monster. There was only her imagination. Her heart pounded, but she was happy, because she had found her story. So I'm gonna read the author's note in this one because it's pretty good. I'm gonna read the author's note in my other one too. But so this says, Mary Shelley was 20 years old when Frankenstein, or The Modern Prometheus, was published in 1818. At first, only 500 copies were published, but soon all of England was talking about the dreadful tale of a man who built a monster from dead bodies. And to think it was written by a young woman. Ladies were scandalized and gentlemen were scornful, but everyone was reading it. As early as 1823, like 100 years ago, the novel was adapted for the stage. Lo and behold, I found myself famous, Mary wrote after seeing a performance. The first film of Frankenstein was produced in 1910, and since then, dozens more film, stage, radio, and TV adaptations of the book have been made. I actually just saw a trailer for this new one that's coming out called Lisa Frankenstein, and it is like, it looks so funny. It's like a 80s Frankenstein revamp, so that like just goes to show, still even today, revamps all the time. In her introduction to the 1831 edition of Frankenstein, Mary tells how the chilling tale of Victor Frankenstein and his monster were born. Her account of the summer of 1816 on Lake Geneva includes the stormy weather, Lord Byron's ghost story challenge, and her waking dream of the pale student of unhallowed arts kneeling beside the thing he had put together. Mary doesn't mention Mary Wollstonecraft in the 1831 introduction, but it seemed important to include her famous mother in the thoughts I imagined Mary might have had as Frankenstein was forming in her subconscious. I also added the deadline to the Ghost Story Challenge, making it more like a contest. And finally, I put the entire group of friends under one roof at Byron's Villa. Actually, Mary, Percy, and Mary's stepsister were staying in a small villa nearby. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is not the same story that most people know from the movies. Unlike the square-headed Hollywood monster with bolts in his neck, the creature that Mary's book can speak and even read. He's lonely and longs to be part of a family, but because of his frightening appearance, he's hated and rejected by everyone, even his creator. When we envision Frankenstein's creature only as the inarticulate, raging monster of stage and screen, we lose sight of Mary's message that hatred and prejudice can turn something innocent into something murderous. Even though it began as a response to a ghost story challenge, Frankenstein is, of course, not exactly a ghost story. For just like Victor Frankenstein, Mary Shelley was creating something new, the kind of story that today we call science fiction. Whenever you read a book or see a movie about a scientist who goes too far, inventing something that becomes dangerous and uncontrollable, remember that it all began with Frankenstein. The monster Mary made lives on in our imaginations, just as vividly as he came into hers that stormy night 200 years ago. Anyways, that is She Made a Monster, How Mary Shelley Created Frankenstein by Lynn Fulton and illustrated by Felicia Sala. Super, super good book. I love picture book biographies. Okay. Next, I have sort of a long one. This has been just like taking the literary world by storm. It's called The Skull by Jon Klassen, and it's a little bit longer. We put it in, we considered it an early chapter book. It does have some chapters. It's about 100 pages, but as you're gonna see, the font's really big. And it's really, really good. So I think you'll understand why we're all like, whoa, this book. So this is The Skull by Jon Klassen. I might not show all of the pages because it's just easier to hold this way, but I will turn it sometimes. So The Skull, because there are really good illustrations. Part 1, The Forest, the Dark, the House. Ottila ran and ran. She ran through the trees and up hills. She ran for a long time, all through the night. Ottila had grown up in this forest, but after a while, the trees began to look different. They were getting closer together. Ottila kept running. As she ran, Ottila began to hear her name being called. She couldn't tell if it was someone else's voice or the wind in her ears. Ottila, 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 Ottila. Ottila suddenly tripped on a fallen branch and fell hard into the snow. She didn't get up. She could not run anymore. She listened for her name, but now it was quiet. Ottila lay in the snow, in the dark and the quiet, and she cried. When she was done crying, she got up and began moving forward again. All at once, the trees stopped. She came out of the woods and into an open yard. In front of her, in the distance, was a very old house. Ottila went up to the house. It looked abandoned, but when she tried to open the door, it was locked. She knocked loudly to see if anyone was inside, but nobody came to the door. "Hello?" she called out. "Hello," someone answered. Ottila looked up and to where the voice had come from. In the window above the door, she saw a skull looking at her. Part 2. The Skull, the Rooms, the Dance. There she is with the skull. The skull moved himself a little closer, a little so he could see better. "Hello," he said again. "Hello," said Ottila. "My name is Ottila. I ran away and I need a place to hide and rest." The skull was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I will come down and let you in, but only if you promise to carry me once I do. I am just a skull, and rolling around is difficult for me." Ottila was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "All right." The skull left the window. Ottila waited outside the door. She waited for a long time. It was very quiet. Then she heard some small scratching on the other side of the door. The latch turned and the door cracked open against the snow. The skull pushed the door open wider. "Thank you," said Ottila. "You're welcome," said the skull. Ottila picked him up. She had never picked up a skull before. "Come in," said the skull. "I will show you the house." "All right," said Ottila. They walked into the hall. "It is a nice house," said Ottila. "Yes," said the skull. "I have always liked it here." "Have you lived here for a long time?" said Ottila. "Yes," said the skull. They went into a room. "This is the fireplace room," said the skull. "I come here to drink tea by the fire in the evenings." "You can make tea?" said Ottila. "No, not anymore," said the skull. "Can you make a fire?" said Ottila. "No," said the skull. They were quiet. "Is that you in the picture?" said Ottila. "It used to be," said the skull. They went into the garden room. "Oh, I like this room," said Ottila. "This is my favorite room," said the skull. "Can you eat the pears?" said Ottila. "I can eat the ones that fall on the ground, but I can't reach the good ones on the branches," said the skull. "I will get one for you," said Ottila. She held a pear for him and he took a bite. The bite of pear went through him and fell onto the floor. "Ah, delicious," said the skull. "Thank you." They went into a room with masks hung on the wall. "What are these masks for?" said Ottila. "I used to collect them," said the skull. "Can you wear them?" said Ottila. "They are just for show," said the skull. "You are not supposed to wear them." But then I find it funny because in the next picture, they're totally wearing the masks. They went downstairs. "What is this room?" said Ottila. "This is the dungeon," said the skull. "There's nobody in it now." "What is this hole?" said Ottila. "That is a bottomless pit," said the skull. Ottila threw the core of her pear into the hole and listened. It did not make a sound. "Do you want to see the tower?" said the skull. "All right," said Ottila. Dropping it into the bottomless pit. They climbed the steps to the tower. "Does anybody else know about this house?" said Ottila. "No," said the skull. "You are the first person to find it in a very long time." They got to the top and walked out onto the balcony. "You can see everything from here," said the skull. "It's beautiful," said Ottila. "Careful," said the skull. "The wall is not very high, and it is a long way down if you fall." They looked out over the forest. You said you ran, oops, sorry. You said you ran away, said the skull. Yes, said Ottila. You don't want them to find you. No, said Ottila, I don't. The skull waited to see if she wanted to say any more, but she didn't. All right, said the skull. Then he said, there is a big room I haven't shown you. How big? Said Ottila. This is the biggest room I've ever seen, said Ottila. This is the ballroom, said the skull. It was for dancing. There were lots of dances here. I went to a dance once, said Ottila, but it was not in a room like this. I did like the dancing, though. I love dancing, said the skull. Ottila put her mask back on. She carried the skull to the middle of the ballroom. She held him to her face. Would you care to dance, sir? Said Ottila. M'lady, said the skull. They danced and danced and danced until it got dark. Part 3. The secret, the bedroom, the headless skeleton. When it was dark, Ottila made some tea and a fire in the fireplace. Would you give me some tea, please? Said the skull. Ottila took a teacup and poured the tea through his mouth and onto the chair. Ah, nice and warm, said the skull. Thank you. You can spend the night here if you want to, said the skull. I do want to, said Ottila. There is something I should tell you, said the skull. Ottila put her tea down. There is a skeleton that comes here to this house, said the skull. It is a headless skeleton. It walks around the hall looking for me. When it finds me, it chases me. Has it ever caught you? Said Ottila. No, said the skull quietly, but I am not as fast as I used to be. Ottila looked closely at the skull. You don't want it to catch you. No, whispered the skull. I don't. Will it come tonight? Said Ottila. The skull looked at the fire. It comes every night, he said. Ottila looked at the fire too. All right, she said. She kept looking at the fire and started to think. When it was time to go to sleep, the skull showed Ottila to a bedroom. It was a nice room. There was a big, comfortable bed and some pajamas for her to wear. Ottila liked the pajamas. We should try to get some sleep, said the skull. The skeleton will come soon enough. Ottila blew out the light. They slept deeply and peacefully for a long time. The house was dark and very quiet until, in the middle of the night, a headless skeleton opened the bedroom door. From somewhere in the skeleton's chest came a voice, but it only shouted the same thing. Give me that skull! I want that skull! The skeleton ran into the room. It was faster than Ottila had expected. She had just enough time to grab the skull before it reached him. The skeleton pulled at the skull, trying to get him away from her, but Ottila held on tight. She did not let go. Finally, she got the skull free. She slipped past the skeleton and ran for the door. Give me that skull! I want that skull! Give me that skull! I want that skull! pushed him over the edge. They watched the skeleton fall into the dark until they heard it land, the sound of bones hitting the ground. They listened some more, but they did not hear anything after that. "All right," said Ottila, "time for bed." Ottila carried the skull quietly back down to the bedroom. She put him on the pillow and tucked him under the blanket. Then she put on her coat. "Aren't you going to sleep too?" said the skull. "In a little while," said Ottila, patting the skull gently. "I'll be back soon." She blew out the candle and closed the bedroom door. Tucked in. Part 4. The bones, the fire, the pit. Ottila went into the kitchen and found a bucket, a kettle with tea leaves, a teacup, and a rolling pin. Then she went out into the night and climbed down, slowly, carefully, to where the skeleton had fallen. When she got to the bottom, she found the skeleton's bones scattered everywhere. She gathered them into the bucket. She found every single one. Ottila carried the bucket of bones to a rock. She took a bone out of the bucket and put it on the rock. Then she took out the rolling pin, held it over her head, and smashed the bone. She smashed it over and over into smaller and smaller pieces until the pieces were as small as they could get. Then she took out another bone and she did it again. She did it to all of them. Then Ottila made a fire. She made it huge and hot. She melted some snow into the kettle with the tea leaves and made tea over the fire. Then she took the bone pieces and threw them into the flames. She poured her tea into the teacup and drank it as she watched the pieces burn to ash. When the fire was over, she gathered the ashes into the bucket and carried it back up the hill, back to the house. She went down to the dungeon and dropped the whole bucket into the bottomless pit. She watched it fall into the darkness and listened. It did not make a sound. Then she climbed back upstairs and went to bed. Part 5. Breakfast. In the morning, Ottila and the skull had breakfast. Ottila made tea and picked some pears from the branches. "I'm sorry last night was so frightening," said the skull. Ottila smiled and patted the skull. "It's over now," she said. "Thank you for helping me," said the skull. "You're welcome," said Ottila. "I wonder if the skeleton will ever come back," said the skull. Ottila cut a piece of pear. "It won't," she said. The skull looked out the window. "It is a nice day outside. Do you want to go for a walk?" They went for a walk. It was a nice day outside. Ottila stopped and gave the skull a bite of pear. It went through him and fell onto the sled. "Thank you," said the skull. He took another bite. "You know," he said, chewing the pear, "you could stay here with me if you want." "Do you want me to stay?" said Ottila. "Yes," said the skull. "I do." "All right," said Ottila. The end. That was kind of spooky, right? I love it. I mean, like, spooky for all ages, you know? So I did want to read you the author's note for this one too, because Jon Klassen has a really fun story about the story that he wrote, which was sort of not his story, as he will explain here. Author's note. I found this story in a library in Alaska. I was there to do a presentation at the library, and I was looking at books on the shelves before it started. I picked out a book of folktales and looked at the table of contents and saw a story called The Skull and thought it was a good title. I stood there and read it, put the book back on its shelf, did my presentation, and left the library. I thought about that story on the plane back home, and then again when I got home, and then I thought about it every now and then for about a year. Finally, I thought I should probably read that story again. I couldn't remember the name of the book it had been in, so I wrote to the library in Alaska and told them about the skull story, and somehow they found the book and sent me the name. Librarians are really good at that. But when I sat down and read the story again, I was surprised. It wasn't the story I remembered. In the years in between, my brain had changed it without telling me. In the Alaska book, Ottila bests the headless skeleton simply by not letting go of the skull all night while he tries to pull it away, and at dawn, as the sun comes through the window, the spell over all of them is broken. The skeleton vanishes and the skull turns into a beautiful lady in white. The castle is filled with nice things and children to play with, and the lady in white gives all of this to Ottila, and then she also vanishes. I didn't remember any of that. My brain had changed the ending a lot. It had changed it more or less to the ending in the book you are holding. I liked my brain's new version. This is a very interesting thing about that our brains do to stories. If you read this book once and put it back on the shelf, a year from now, someone asks you how this story went, the same thing will happen. Your brain will change it. You will tell them a story that is a little different, maybe in a way your brain likes better. I like folktales because that is what is supposed to happen to them. They are supposed to be changed by who is telling them, and you never find them the same way twice. I hope you liked my brain's version. That is the end of The Skull by Jon Klassen. And that's all I have for you today. So that was Lunchtime Listens, Spooky Edition. And tune in next Monday for another few chapters of Frankenstein with Anne and Christina. And thank you for tuning in to Storytime for Adults on the Deerfield Public Library Twitch channel. I'm Emily. Bye.